This is Process and Reality, the only officially unofficial guide to reading Alfred North Whitehead. I'm your host, Tyler Davis. Welcome to the show. All right, so we're in the next chapter of, well, not really the next chapter. We're in the author's preface of Process and Reality. I'm your host, Tyler Davis. Yeah, I don't know if I ever said my name in the first episode. I was thinking about staying anonymous. I don't know. Whatever. Doesn't really matter. If you're ever in Chicago, hit me up. We can grab a drink somewhere and hang out, talk about philosophy if you want. Since I grew up in the Christian Baptist tradition, I'm a really big believer in reading a passage over you that we're going to study. I think it's a good way to keep me honest if I'm misreading something or whatever. So I'm going to read through this passage once for you, with you. And yeah, here we go. Here's the author's preface by Alfred North Whitehead. These lectures are based upon a recurrence to that phase of philosophic thought which began with Descartes and ended with Hume. The philosophic scheme which they endeavored to explain is termed the philosophy of organism. There is no doctrine put forward which cannot cite in its defense some explicit statement of one of this group of thinkers, or of one of the two founders of all Western thought, Plato and Aristotle. But the philosophy of organism is apt to emphasize just those elements in the writings of these masters which subsequent systematizers have put aside. The writer who most fully anticipated the main positions of the philosophy of organism is John Locke in his essay, especially in its later books. The lectures are divided into 5 parts. In the first part, the method is explained, and the scheme of ideas in terms of which the cosmology is to be framed is stated summarily. In the second part, an endeavor is made to exhibit this scheme as adequate for the interpretation of the ideas and problems which form the complex texture of civilized thought. Apart from such an investigation, the summary statement of Part 1 is practically unintelligible. Thus, Part 2 at once gives meaning to the verbal phrases of the scheme by their use and discussion, and shows the power of the scheme to put the various elements of our experience into a consistent relation to each other. In order to obtain a reasonably complete account of human experience, considered in relation to the philosophical problems which naturally arise, the group of philosophers and scientists belonging to the 17th and 18th centuries has been considered. In particular, Descartes, Newton, Locke, Hume, Kant. Any one of these writers is one-sided in his presentation of the groundwork of experience, but as a whole they give a general presentation which dominates the development of subsequent philosophy. I started the investigation with the expectation of being occupied with the exposition of the divergencies from every member of this group, but a careful examination of their exact statements disclosed that, in the main, the philosophy of organism is a recurrence to pre-Kantian modes of thought. These philosophers were perplexed by the inconsistent presuppositions underlying their inherent modes of expression. Insofar as they or their successors have endeavored to be rigidly systematic, the tendency has been to abandon just those elements in their thought upon which the philosophy of organism bases itself. An endeavor has been made to point out the exact points of agreement and of disagreement. In the second part, the discussions of modern thought have been confined to the most general notions of physics and biology, with a careful avoidance of all detail. Also, it must be one of the motives of a complete cosmology to construct a system of ideas which brings the aesthetic, moral, and religious interests into relation with those concepts of the world which have their origin in natural science. In the third and fourth parts, the cosmological scheme is developed in terms of its own categorical notions, and without much regard to other systems of thought. For example, in Part 2, there is a chapter on the extensive continuum, which is largely concerned with the notions of Descartes and Newton, compared with the way in which the organic philosophy must interpret this feature of the world. But in Part 4, this question is treated from the point of view of developing the detailed method in which the philosophy of organism establishes the theory of this problem. It must be thoroughly understood that the theme of these lectures is not a detached consideration of various traditional philosophical problems which acquires urgency in certain traditional systems of thought. The lectures are intended to state a condensed scheme of cosmological ideas, to develop their meaning by confrontation with the various topics of experience, and finally, to elaborate an adequate cosmology, in terms of which all particular topics find their interconnections. Thus, the unity of treatment is to be looked for in the gradual development of the scheme, in meaning and in relevance, and not in the successive treatment of particular topics. For example, the doctrines of time, of space, of perception, and of causality are recurred to again and again as the cosmology develops. In each recurrence, these topics throw some new light on the scheme or receive some new elucidation. At the end, insofar as the enterprise has been successful, there should be no problem of space-time, or of epistemology, or of causality left over for discussion. The scheme should have developed all those generic notions, adequate for the expression of any possible interconnection of things. Among the contemporary schools of thought, my obligations to the English and American realists are obvious. In this connection, I should especially like to mention Professor T.P. Nunn of the University of London. His anticipations in The Proceedings of the Aristotelian Society of some of the doctrines of recent realism do not appear to be sufficiently well known. I am also greatly indebted to Bergson, William James, and John Dewey. One of my preoccupations has been to rescue their type of thought from the charge of anti-intellectualism, which rightly or wrongly has been associated with it. Finally, though throughout the main body of the work I am in sharp disagreement with Bradley, the final outcome is after all not so greatly different. I am particularly indebted to his chapter on the nature of experience, which appears in his essays on truth and reality. His insistence on feeling is very consonant with my own conclusions. This whole metaphysical position is an implicit repudiation of the doctrine of vacuous actuality. The fifth part is concerned with the final interpretation of the ultimate way in which the cosmological problem is to be conceived. It answers the question, what does it all come to? In this part, the approximation to Bradley is evident. Indeed, if the cosmology be deemed successful, it becomes natural at this point to ask whether the type of thought involved be not a transformation of some main doctrines of absolute idealism onto a realistic basis. These lectures will be best understood by noting the following list of prevalent habits of thought, which are repudiated insofar as concerns their influence on philosophy. 2. The trust in language as an adequate expression of propositions. 3. The mode of philosophical thought which implies and is implied by the faculty psychology. 4. The subject-predicate form of expression. 5. The sensationalist doctrine of perception. 6. The doctrine of vacuous actuality. 7. The Kantian doctrine of the objective world as a theoretical construct from purely subjective experience. 8. Arbitrary deductions in ex absurdo arguments. And 9. Belief that logical inconsistencies can indicate anything else than some antecedent errors. By reason of its ready acceptance of some or all of these 9 myths and fallacious procedures, much 19th century philosophy excludes itself from relevance to the ordinary stubborn facts of daily life. The positive doctrine of these lectures is concerned with the becoming, the being, and the relatedness of actual entities. An actual entity is a res vera in the Cartesian sense of the term. It is the Cartesian substance, and not the Aristotelian primary substance. But Descartes retained in his metaphysical doctrine the Aristotelian dominance of the category of quality over that of relatedness. In these lectures, relatedness is dominant over quality. All relatedness has its foundation in the relatedness of actualities, and such relatedness is wholly concerned with the appropriation of the dead by the living. That is to say, with objective immortality, whereby what is divested of its own immediacy becomes a real component in other living immediacies of becoming. This is the doctrine that the creative advance of the world is the becoming, the perishing, and the objective immortalities of those things which jointly constitute stubborn fact. The history of philosophy discloses two cosmologies which, at different periods, have dominated European thought: Plato's Timaeus and the cosmology of the 17th century, whose chief authors were Galileo, Descartes, Newton, and Locke. In attempting an enterprise of the same kind, it is wise to follow the clue that perhaps the true solution consists in a fusion of the two previous schemes, with modifications demanded by self-consistency and the advance of knowledge. The cosmology explained in these lectures has been framed in accordance with this reliance on the positive value of the philosophical tradition. One of the tests of success is adequacy in the comprehension of the variety of experience within the limits of one scheme of ideas. The endeavor to satisfy this condition is illustrated by comparing chapters 3, 7, and 10 of Part 2, respectively entitled The Order of Nature, The Subjectivist Principle and Process, with chapter 5 of Part 3, entitled The Higher Phases of Experience, and with chapter 5 of Part 4, entitled Measurement, and with chapter 2 of Part 5, entitled God and the World. These chapters should be recognizable as the legitimate outcome of the one scheme of ideas stated in the second chapter of Part 1. In these lectures, I have endeavored to compress the material derived from years of meditation. In putting out these results, 4 strong impressions dominate my mind. First, that the movement of historical and philosophical criticism of detached questions, which on the whole has dominated the last 2 centuries, has done its work and requires to be supplemented by a more sustained effort of constructive thought. Secondly, that the true method of philosophical construction is to frame a scheme of ideas the best one can, and unflinchingly to explore the interpretation of experience in terms of that scheme. Thirdly, that all constructive thought on the various special topics of scientific interest is dominated by some such scheme, unacknowledged but no less influential in guiding the imagination. The importance of philosophy lies in its sustained effort to make such schemes explicit and thereby capable of criticism and improvement. There remains the final reflection. How shallow, puny, and imperfect are efforts to sound the depths in the nature of things. In philosophical discussion, the merest hint of dogmatic certainty as to the finality of statement is an exhibition in folly. In the expansion of these lectures to the dimensions of the present book, I have been greatly indebted to the critical difficulties suggested by members of my Harvard class. Also, this work would never have been written without the constant encouragement and counsel which I owe to my wife. Alfred North Whitehead, Harvard University, January 1929. That's probably the most text that I'm going to read you at one point. So I said that the method was going to be line by line, but I feel like the preface is pretty straightforward. There's a couple of ideas that he lays out in dormant form here. I don't think it's best to discuss them in the preface. He starts just saying words and you don't know what they mean, and then he starts defining them in the next chapter, but there's some that he doesn't define until even later. And so I think for our purposes today, I think we're just going to note a couple of things. First, you've probably picked up on the fact that this is an older way of writing. He's using passive voice. He's using antecedent pronouns. That's when you say it, or, he has a very elliptical way of referring to things. Instead of saying this isn't an absolute statement, he would say something like, as to the finality of the things which must be said, like, it's just like, okay. He's just a little verbose, like the Englishman that he is, Luckily, I have that degree in communications, and so we're gonna do this. There are a couple things I do want to note. The philosophy of organism, like I mentioned in the previous podcast, that is code for process philosophy. Whitehead did not refer to his own philosophy as process philosophy. That's what it became known as far as I know. He always referred to it as philosophy of organism. So we're going to use those terms synonymously. He talks about the philosophic scheme which philosophers from Descartes to Hume endeavored to explain is termed the philosophy of organism. He's naming the philosophy. The is termed is him. He is the one who has termed it. So again, not great on the active voice there. No one else has called a philosophy the philosophy of organism except for him. So one of the big, huge points of his philosophy is that we cannot get away from Plato and Aristotle. If you want to play around in philosophy, you gotta read some Plato and Aristotle. So, just cue that up on your side reading and get cracking away at it. No, but in all seriousness, really, there's a wealth of ideas that have been explored and discovered and articulated in their writings, and Whitehead doesn't try to escape them. He says they put forward this wealth of ideas, and so intellectuals have neglected some of their ideas when they have been systematizing their work, but Whitehead believes that his philosophy doesn't neglect some of their points that have been neglected up to this point. Whitehead thinks that John Locke most fully anticipated Whitehead's philosophy. Just a brief overview of what he is basically saying in this preface. The Gifford lectures, they're outlined in 5 parts. So in the first 2 seasons, we're going to cover part 1. Okay, I know that sounds insane, but the first part of this book is absolutely dense. It's his entire philosophy. He's laying out the scheme of ideas. If you imagine, if you're familiar with Wittgenstein and the Tractatus, how he writes that's kind of what we're dealing with here, is just this very dense philosophical articulation at the beginning where you set up the conditions for your philosophy in a chapter, and the rest of it is exemplification. That is so beautiful and elegant and simple and very, very mathematically influenced right there. As a mathematician, that's kind of it, is like the actual theorem is small, the proofs of it are long. So that's kind of how we deal with this. So in the first 2 seasons, we're going to cover part 1. In part 1, he explains his method. And then he states the scheme of ideas. That's the framework. This is his metaphysical framework. This is how he's attempting to account for all experience. Part 2, he makes the system relevant to ideas and problems which other thinkers have highlighted. The philosophy of organism is a recurrence to pre-Kantian modes of thought. This is going to come up over and over and over. We're going to highlight it a lot. He is also incorporating the abandoned elements of lots of philosophy. In the 3rd and 4th part of the book, Whitehead is going to expound on the system that he lays out in part 1. Finally, in the last part of the book, Whitehead is supposed to answer the question, what does it all come to? Whitehead ends his preface with Whitehead's no-no list that he calls myths and fallacious procedures. It took me quite a long time to understand what this list even meant, why it was even important, until I started reading and then realized as time went on why it's so important. So it's actually super important that you understand this. So I'm spending the most time on this. Again, like I said, we're going to try and go line by line. The preface is fairly easy to read aside from this last little portion, which is rather dense. So first, you're not allowed to distrust speculative philosophy and discount it out of hand. A lot of people do this just because this is called the fallacy. That because someone got to a conclusion through a fallacious procedure means that it itself is wrong is also a fallacy. And essentially, this is kind of the method of induction, is that we have hunches and inklings and we have to test them out. And so if we can't test out our hunches and inklings by speculating, then we might as well give up on the knowledge endeavor at all, because we have to be able to hypothesize and test our hypotheses. And that includes in philosophy. So you can't just be distrustive because someone's speculating. You can distrust someone who's speculating and not actually critically reflecting on it. That's totally fine for you to do. But someone who's willing to throw away their ideas if they're critically thinking on them, but they're starting with speculating, you can't just distrust that out of hand, okay? The second one is that you're not allowed to trust in language as an adequate expression of propositions. He has a whole section kind of dedicated to this, so I'm not going to spend too much time worrying about this, but here we're going to make a distinction between verbal expressions and propositions. Propositions are like in math, like the Pythagorean theorem is a proposition. It's just so pure, right? The language we use to describe the Pythagorean theorem is not an adequate expression of that proposition, right? So we need to distinguish between pure relationships, i.e. propositions, and our expression of a proposition. That might be kind of like super dark and muddy right there, but essentially language, you should be suspicious of language, but not so suspicious that you can't use it. Okay, so that's rule number 2. Rule number 3 is that you're not allowed to use, or you're not allowed to view things in terms of faculty psychology. Well, what that means is you're not allowed to see the world like, you're not allowed to see the mind like Thomas Aquinas did. A set of faculties, all separately assigned to different mental tasks. That's not how neuroscience even works. This has been a long since debunked way of thinking. We do not have faculties. We have a lot of ecologically interconnected functions in our brains. And so the faculty psychology is just a direct outcome of a certain rigid framework that we'll talk more about probably, but essentially it leads into all sorts of problems. If you're not familiar with this, you'll probably become familiar with this. So the fourth of the no-nos is that you're not allowed to take the subject predicate form of expression as inherently descriptive of reality. It's a linguistic expression and it plagues us. It doesn't actually express reality. So just because we use something in a thought form or a thought pattern doesn't necessarily make it reality. And that's part of the problem of linguistic determinism, is that our language kind of determines how we view reality, but that doesn't necessarily make it so. Okay. The fifth thing that you're not allowed to do is you're not allowed to adhere to the sensationalist doctrine of perception. Sensationalism, I had to kind of look this one up, but the sensationalism in epistemology and psychology is a form of empiricism that limits experience as a source of knowledge to sensation or sense perceptions. Sensationalism is a consequence of the idea that the mind is a blank slate. Tabula rasa is the idea. Like it's you are born as this sort of blank slate. This is going to come out. The reason why this is not true in Whitehead's scheme is that experience is a part of subatomic particles. So there's no such thing as a blank slate entirely, even in some sort of subatomic level. So we'll get more into that. The sixth no-no is that you're not allowed to believe in vacuous actuality. So this one we'll just define right now because he uses it a couple times without definition. This is a quote taken from Panexperientialist Physicalism and the Mind-Body Problem by David Gray Griffin. And if you recognize that name, congratulations. He's the guy who edited this book. Super smart guy. Dualists and materialists agree against idealists that the physical world is actual, and that they also agree on the nature of the actualities comprising that world. They both accept a materialistic analysis according to which these actualities, at least the most elementary ones, are wholly devoid of experience. We can, following Whitehead, call this idea vacuous actuality. So the idea is that at the base level of life, there is material that has no experience. It is not living, nothing. Whitehead rejects this notion. He goes for panexperientialism, panpsychism. Those are also two great Wikipedia articles I should have recommended probably in the first episode. That's the view of Whitehead. So he says vacuous actuality, that there is atoms in a vacuum, doesn't fit with this framework. So just forget about it. Or if you're not going to forget about it, at least you should hold that very suspiciously. It doesn't quite make sense. And we'll get into why that is. The seventh major no-no is that you are not allowed to adhere to the Kantian doctrine of the objective world as a theoretical construct from purely subjective experience. If you don't know what this is, you need to listen to the episodes on Kant by Philosophize This, Stephen West. Yeah, there's not really much to be said here other than that a lot of people hold to this. I think a lot of postmodernist kind of thinking comes out of this, where it's just like, yeah, the real world exists, but you can't really know it. And this is just the kind of I think Kant was trying to do a good thing. He was trying to do crazy things and synthesize some very interesting ideas. And one of those outcomes is the Kantian doctrine of the objective world as a theoretical construct. So the eighth no-no on the list is that you're not allowed to make arbitrary deductions in ex absurdo arguments. This is super popular. I have friends who do this. It's just absolutely asinine. I've probably done it at some times before. Basically, in formal logic, the reductio ad absurdum argument is actually a legitimate argument, but it's often applied fallaciously. So this is when you're taking a legitimate argument, you're applying it in a very arbitrary manner. The fallacy is basically that if the premises of someone's argument are taken as true, then it necessarily leads to absurd conclusions. There's the way that you use ad absurdum arguments is that you are taking them to their logical conclusion, which then is exposed to be absurd, and therefore you defeat their argument. But what happens is that in a reductio ad absurdum fallacy, what you're doing is you're taking someone's argument, you're just picking on one of their premises and saying that it necessarily leads to some absurd conclusion when it hasn't actually been proven to be the case. I don't know if this is super clear, but basically it's like you are taking something that is unknown and assuming the worst case scenario from it. It's almost a form of slippery slope, because you're saying, well, if this premise is actually true, then it must necessarily lead to this point. Well, the fact that your opponent's arguing for some other outcome of it means that they don't think that that's the case. And so it's a little bit of, it's just cheap, basically. So, yeah, enough said about ex absurdo arguments. The ninth no-no and final no-no is that you're not allowed to believe that logical inconsistencies only can indicate anything else than some antecedent errors. This is kind of wordy, but basically just because there's a contradiction in the conclusion of some sort of philosophical thought or something like that, there are problems, doesn't necessarily mean that there is some sort of error that has been made. You can be on a fine track of thinking, and you can fine tune it, and it leads you into a more refined articulation. So you can be on the right path and be a hair or so off, and that could lead you into no man's land. But actually, if you correct course along the way, you'll be doing just fine. For example, in physics, as we continue to move forward, we revise in retrospect. Antecedent errors is kind of the wrong way to characterize what we're formulating. It's more helpful to consider problems that come up as the result of half-truths instead of true or false. Half-truths is the paradigm that we're after. In Whitehead's opinion, lots of 19th century philosophy excludes itself from relevance by subjecting itself to these lines of reasoning. If there's something you don't understand, feel free to ask us a question. Drop it in any one of our sources of communication. You can leave us a message at Process Memes, or you can drop it in the comments on the episode. I don't know if that's possible. Do whatever you want.